Boss monsters need help. In Forge of Foes, myself and Scott Gray and Teos Abadia describe boss monsters. And one of the things that I wanted to hammer a stake into the ground on is that boss monsters need help simply because they're bosses. That the minute you put a boss monster out there, characters and players love to zero in on that boss and beat the hell out of that thing. They use every spell at their disposal, every way to stop that boss from doing anything that they can do, hitting them as hard as they can. There isn't this, very rarely do characters go and separate out and go fight all the minions. Instead, they almost always zero in on the boss, which means the boss needs ways to be able to handle that focus. In D&D 2024 and in the D&D 2025 Monster Manual, it looks like legendary monsters have gotten a pretty significant boost to damage output to account for the fact that they are legendary. Beyond, even if you compare them to a monster of equal challenge rating, there have been some studies that have shown, there have been some web pages where they've talked about how legendary monsters do more damage than non-legendary at the same challenge rating. That's a good impression. However, usually what they need is defense, not offense. Usually high challenge rating monsters, if you're in the assumption you're running more modern ones, they do a lot of damage already, but they need more protection. The most common way to protect a boss monster from getting completely pinned down and destroyed is through a thing called legendary resistance. If you're familiar with 5th edition D&D, you've seen legendary resistance applied to legendary monsters since the 2014 Monster Manual came out. And basically the way they work is that a monster has so many legendary resistances, and if they fail a saving throw, they can turn one of those in to succeed on the saving throw instead. Some people really don't like it. Matt Colville, for example, has said that he really hates legendary resistance. Lots of players don't like it too because it feels arbitrary. There's no real reason for why this monster has this thing, and all it does is shut down our cool abilities. The thing is, if you didn't have it, those bosses would just get pinned down and destroyed. The bosses would be really anticlimactic if they didn't have some way to deal with save or suck effects. Oh, we banished it, or we dominated it, or we polymorphed it. There's all of these spells that can take out a boss in a single hit, on the assumption it makes its saving throw, which, probably about half the time. So it needs something like legendary resistance to be able to deal with it. But a lot of people don't like legendary resistance because it does feel like this arbitrary nope button that says, no, you're not going to get it to work. So today we're going to talk about a few different ways to deal with legendary resistance, alternatives to legendary resistance that are out there, and ways to make legendary resistance a little bit more interesting for you and for your players. So one of the big ones is showing your players that the monster has legendary resistance and how many of them they have. One way to do this is have little tokens on your table or some kind of visual display, whether it's a index card that everyone can see that has check boxes on it, little boxes for every one of the legendary resistances, and every time you burn one off, you check it off. That way they can see the progress they're making by burning through legendary resistances and match that against how the battle is going and decide, do they want to keep burning down legendary resistances with save or suck spells, or do they want to just keep hitting it with damage? One thing I've noticed is that almost all the time, my legendary monsters die before they use up all their legendary resistances, which means that players are wise to the fact that they have legendary resistance and don't want to waste a spell when they're like, I guess I'll hit it with damage instead because I know that my dominate monster isn't going to work. I think that's a fine strategy. But some groups do like to burn through legendary resistance or even still see how they're burning through legendary resistance, and having some kind of physical way of showing the legendary resistances that a monster has works. One other real important tip is tell your players when they're fighting a legendary monster. You don't have to hold it back. Let them know. Tell them this is a legendary monster. It's going to have legendary resistances. Let them know. You don't have to hide that, and it's a lot less fun for them when they blow a big spell and go, oh crap, I didn't know it was legendary, right? That's lame. Instead, tell them it's a legendary monster. If they cast a spell, remind them, well, he's got legendary resistance. Are you sure? This is that whole idea that sometimes players are only getting about half of what you're telling them. They're not idiots. They really wish they hadn't, they're going to wish they hadn't done it unless they know. But if you tell them that they have legendary resistance and you show them how many they have, then the players are making informed choices about what they're going to do when they're casting their big effects. Now, another way is to show the legendary resistances in game. Level Up Advanced 5e does this, and the Flea Mortals also does this, which is a way to show in the world what a legendary resistance is. An easy way is you face the Auravax, the adult black dragon, and over his head you see 3 spinning glyphs. and then you tell him those glyphs are his legendary resistances. And every time you hit him, one of those glyphs disappears. So now you have kind of an interesting way to show what the legendary resistance is. Maybe they are a necklace with 3 glyph stones. Maybe they're 3 ion stones that are spinning around their head. Maybe they've got carved scales. Maybe they've got shields of protection that shatter every time one of them is destroyed. Try to imagine what a legendary resistance looks like in the world. And that way your players can see what they're doing in the world itself. That's kind of a fun way to do it. The original lead designer of the 2014 version of D&D, Mike Merles, had an interesting one that he brought up, which was the idea of, instead of legendary resistance, what if a legendary monster auto-saves on all saving throws until they're bloodied? I.e., for the first half of the battle, you have to inflict damage to them. They're going to automatically save on all other effects. But then as soon as you get them down to bloodied, now they're making saving throws like normal. It was interesting. We talked about this in the Sly Flourish Discord server and got pushback on that idea, saying it was too arbitrary. I don't know that it's any less arbitrary than normal legendary resistances are. I don't think it's actually any harder for the players either, because, again, my players often destroy a monster before it even uses all its legendary resistances. So if it's going to have all of these legendary resistances to save anyway, why not just have it automatically save every time until it's bloodied? And now the strategy for fighting monsters is different. I brought it up with my group and they were kind of like, yeah, that's kind of interesting. We'll try that. So I might throw that on some boss monster one time, that instead of having legendary resistances, they have this auto save, automatically succeed on saving throws until they're halfway down. Again, I would tell my players that this is going to happen. I would not surprise them by this. I would explain that that's how it's going to work so that they can tell that that's going to work. Don't try to hide the strategy. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting way. Now, another one, which I talked about when I was talking about running my Ancient Black Dragon, is Doom Points. So Doom Points is a feature of Tales of the Valiant. Tales of the Valiant has many really cool ideas that you can bring into any of your 5e games. The luck system, replacing inspiration, is one of them. The other one is Doom Points. I have referred to these when I was testing them myself as Dreadful Blessings, but you can call them whatever you want. Doom Points is fine. Dreadful Blessings is also fine. The concept here is that in different encounters, you have these Doom Points. You have a number of Doom Points that are based on like the CR of the encounter. But another way to handle it is to basically replace legendary resistances with Doom Points. So Doom Points can do what legendary resistances do. You can turn in a Doom Point in order to automatically save on a saving throw you might fail. But you can also use them for other things, and you get to decide what those other things are. Some examples, which you can find in the Monster Vault and in the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, include things like getting advantage on attacks, or forcing someone's disadvantage on a saving throw, piercing through elemental resistance. There's lots of different things you can do with it. But really, they're sort of like a GM intrusion point from like the Cypher system for 5e, where we can look at it and say, these points let the monster break the rules. So an extreme example would be a Death Knight with a Doom Point can rip through a Force Cage, right? Or a ancient green dragon can use a Doom Point to have its poison breath pierce through elemental resistances and turn elemental immunity, poison immunity, into poison resistance instead. It kind of barrels through the immunity because of it. You could use them to have a monster recharge and automatically use a breath weapon. You could have a monster that gets an extra action because they use this thing. So you can use them for lots of different things. I have kind of two hard rules that I keep in mind when I'm talking about using Doom Points or Dreadful Blessings. One is I describe how they work to the players before we ever use them, so they understand what they are and how they work. And two, I make sure it's clear to the players how many of those Doom Points there are in a battle by, again, check marks on an index card or little tokens that are in front of me, so they know that they're in place and they know when I've used them and they know they're gone and I can't use them again. So that is the limitation on it. The other limitation is you are only using these to make the game more interesting. You're not punishing your players. You're not trying to get them. It's not a competition. You only use them in a way that you think makes the game overall more interesting. If you think the boss is just going down too quickly, maybe he uses them to drain all of the hit points from nearby enemies in order to get extra temporary hit points himself. Or again, if you feel like the monster is just not providing the kind of challenge that it should, given its position in the fiction of the game, you can use Doom Points to increase that challenge. So I think it's a really powerful tool. I think it's really cool. And it's I've been using it in my Wednesday game, and I've had good success, and I've gotten good feedback from my players that they don't feel like they're this complete arbitrary cheat card, and instead are interesting ways for the characters to face these big monsters that they're facing. And then finally, you can just stick to good old Legendary Resistance. The 2025 Monster Manual didn't do anything, didn't really change Legendary Resistance at all. And if they're working fine for you, they're working. You don't necessarily have to try any of this other stuff. If you don't like any of these ideas, of course you don't have to do any of these ideas. But it's kind of nice to have a toolbox of different potential things we could do for monsters in order to make sure that boss monsters provide an interesting, challenging threat to the characters without stealing agency away from the characters and making it clear to players what the system is that they're playing in order to defeat these things, but also ensuring that they're not just completely dominating boss monsters. So those are just a handful of potential alternatives to Legendary Resistance. Hope you found that useful. If you like this show and you want to help me out, the way you can help me out is by subscribing to my Sly Flourish newsletter. Free link in the links below. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a free weekly RPG-related email with links to all of the other work that I do. You can support me directly on Patreon. You get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, and tools and other things to help you run your games, our awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish bookstore, including City of Arches, Forge of Foes, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Lazy DM's Companion, and more, all available in the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.